Once, there was a cruel and jealous queen who had a kind and beautiful daughter. Many princes from faraway lands came to ask for the princess's hand in marriage. But the queen was wicked. To each prince, she said, "Before you can marry my daughter, you must do something for me." Then, she gave them tasks that were impossible to complete. When they failed, she laughed cruelly and said, "Now you will die." Her woodcutter would then cut off their heads. The queen often told her daughter, "You will never marry." The princess was heartbroken, but the queen only laughed at her sadness. Far away, in a small and poor country, lived Prince Charles. When he heard about the beautiful princess, he told his father, "I want to marry her." The king, who loved his son dearly, cried out, "No. You cannot go. That queen is evil. She will kill you, just like the others. You are my only son, I cannot lose you. There are so many beautiful women in the world. You don't need to marry this one." But Prince Charles couldn't stop thinking about the princess. His heart ached, and he became so sad that he couldn't eat or sleep. Seeing his son's misery, the king finally said, "Go then. Go to the princess. I pray you do better than the others. I hope I will see you again." Hearing his father's words, Prince Charles was overjoyed. He danced around his room with excitement, dreaming of the day he would meet the princess. Prince Charles ate a lot of food to regain his strength. Feeling strong and ready, he began his journey. Since his father was poor, he didn't have any servants. "I'll find servants along the way," he thought to himself. Not long after, he came across something strange. In the distance, he saw what looked like a small mountain. "What is that mountain?" he wondered. It wasn't there before. Curious, he walked closer. As he got nearer, he realized it wasn't a mountain at all. It was a very fat man lying on his back, fast asleep. The prince approached him, and the fat man woke up. "What are you doing here?" the prince asked. "I was asleep," replied the fat man, rubbing his eyes, "and now I'm awake because of you." "Why were you sleeping?" asked the prince. "Because I had some food this morning, and now I'm waiting for lunch," the fat man said with a yawn. "What did you eat this morning?" 10 chickens and 100 cakes, said the fat man proudly. The prince was amazed. "Will you be my servant?" he asked. "Give me food," said the fat man, "and I'll do anything for you." The prince agreed, and the fat man followed him on his journey. A little while later, they met another strange man. This man was bent over, with his head low and one of his ears pressed to the ground. His left ear was enormous. "What are you doing?" the prince asked. "I'm listening," the man replied. "Listening to what?" "The flowers," said the man. "They're opening." The prince was astonished by the man's ability. "Will you join us?" he asked. Big Ear nodded, and he too became part of the prince's journey. Big Ear tilted his head and said, "The birds are singing in a country across the sea. I can hear them clearly." The prince was amazed. "What can you hear in the house of the beautiful princess?" he asked eagerly. Big Ear listened carefully. "I can hear people crying," he said. "Another prince has died." Hearing this, the prince grew more determined. "Will you be my servant, Big Ear?" "Yes," said Big Ear. "I will." Not long after, they came across 2 long objects lying by the side of the road. "What are those?" "Trees?" asked Fat Man, squinting at the strange shapes. The prince and his companions walked closer, and Big Ear shook his head. "They're not trees," he said. "They're arms. The longest arms in the world." They followed the arms until they saw the man to whom they belonged. His head appeared in the distance, and his arms stretched out far on either side of him. "You are a very long person," said the prince, astonished. "I can be even longer than this if I stretch out completely," said the man proudly. "Come with me, Long Arms," said the prince. "Be my servant." Long Arms nodded, stood up, and joined the group. A little further down the road, they met another man. He had one hand covering one of his eyes. "Is something wrong with your eye?" asked the prince. "No," the man replied. "I can see very far, across mountains, through buildings, and even underwater. When something is close to me, I have to cover one eye, or I'll see too much." The prince was impressed. "Come with me, Quick Eyes. Be my servant." Quick Eyes smiled and joined the group, and together they continued their journey. The group continued their journey, and the sun grew hotter and hotter. Prince Charles opened his coat to cool down. Along the road, they saw a man sitting under a tree. He was wearing two thick coats and a large hat that covered his face. "I am cold, cold, and cold," the man said, shivering. "Why are you cold?" asked the prince, surprised. "The sun is so hot that we've opened our coats, and we're sweating." "When I open my coat," Cold Man explained, "the sun disappears, snow falls, and everything dies from the cold." The prince was astonished. "Come with me, Cold Man," he said, "and be my servant. But please, don't open your coat." Cold Man agreed and joined them on their journey. Finally, Prince Charles and his servants arrived at the city where the princess lived. The prince went straight to the queen and said boldly, "I want to marry the princess. What must I do?" The queen, with a sly smile, replied, "You will have to do 3 tasks. Do them well, and you can marry her." "What is the first task?" the prince asked. "I have a beautiful blue jewel," the queen said. "Yesterday, it fell into the river. Bring me the jewel before the sun goes down." The prince left the queen and returned to his servants, worried. "How can we find the jewel in the river?" he asked them. Quick Eyes uncovered his eye and said confidently, "I will look for it." Quick Eyes went to the river and scanned the water. "There it is," he said, pointing. "I can't see it," said Long Arms. Without a word, Fat Man opened his enormous mouth and drank all the water in the river. In just a short time, the riverbed was dry. Long Arms reached down, grabbed the blue jewel, and handed it to the prince. The prince returned to the queen and presented the jewel. Her face turned red with anger, but she forced a smile. "Well done," she said through gritted teeth. Inside, she was furious. "Tomorrow, I will give him an impossible task," she thought. She spent the whole night planning and didn't sleep a wink. The next morning, the prince woke up early and went to see the queen. She greeted him with a cold smile. "You must be hungry after your long journey," she said. "Outside, there are 30 chickens. Eat them all before noon. I don't want to find even a single chicken leg left." The prince thought for a moment and said, "May I invite a friend? I don't enjoy eating alone." The queen smirked. "You may invite one friend," she replied. The prince left. And the queen turned to her daughter, laughing. "He will fail. By this afternoon, he'll be dead." The prince returned to his servants and said, "Come with me, Fat Man. Fat Man followed him to the queen's garden, where the 30 chickens were waiting. In no time, Fat Man devoured all the chickens. Then, as if he hadn't eaten enough, he ate the queen's other animals, the bread in the kitchens, the fruit from the trees, and even the vegetables in the ground. When he finished, Fat Man rubbed his stomach and asked, "Now what can I eat?" But there was nothing left. At noon, Fat Man lay snoring while the queen called for her lunch. She waited and waited, but no food came. Frustrated, she stormed to the kitchen and asked the cook, "Where is my lunch?" The cook looked nervous and replied, "A fat man ate everything in the gardens and everything in the kitchens. There is no food left." The queen's face turned bright red with anger. She clenched her fists, fuming, but then an idea came to her. She smirked and laughed to herself. "Now, I will catch him." The next day, the prince came to her as usual. The queen greeted him with a warm smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Will you join me for dinner tonight?" she asked sweetly. "And after that, would you like to sit with the princess for 2 hours?" "Yes," said the prince eagerly. "I would love that." The queen's smile widened. "You won't fall asleep while you're talking to the princess, will you?" "Fall asleep?" the prince exclaimed. "Never." The queen's voice turned cold. "Because if someone falls asleep while sitting with the princess, she disappears by magic. And then, that person dies." The prince swallowed hard but nodded confidently. He put on his most beautiful clothes for the evening and joined the queen for dinner. The food was delicious, and the drink sparkled like jewels. But their conversation was cold and tense, at one point, while the prince turned his head for a moment. The queen quickly slipped a sleeping potion into his glass, her eyes glinting with mischief. The prince didn't notice anything unusual as he drank from his glass. After dinner, the queen led him to the princess. They climbed many stairs to a high room at the top of the castle. The princess sat sadly by the window. The red light of the evening sun lit up her face, making her look even more beautiful. Her dress, the flowers around the window, and the river below all glowed in the same soft color. The prince sat near her, and for a short time, they were happy together. The princess spoke gently, and her voice was like music. But soon, the prince's eyes began to feel heavy. His head drooped, and he struggled to stay awake. Her words became faint in his ears. He couldn't fight it any longer, his eyes closed, and he fell asleep. Half an hour later, he woke up with a start. The princess was gone. He looked around the room in panic but couldn't find her anywhere. Rushing to the window, he called out, "Big Ear! The princess is missing. We have to find her." Big Ear, standing below, pressed his ear to the ground. After a moment, he looked up and said, "I can hear her. She's calling for help. She says she's across the river." Long arms quickly reached up and pulled the prince down from the high room. Together, they prepared to cross the river and rescue the princess. "She's inside a tree," said Big Ear. "Her mother's men put her there." Quick Eyes squinted and nodded. "Yes, I can see her inside the tree. But how can we get to her?" cried the prince in desperation. "I have an idea," said Cold Man, stepping forward. He opened his coat wide, and instantly, snow began to fall. The world turned white and the river froze into solid ice. Without hesitation, Cold Man jumped onto the frozen river. The prince and his servants followed, running across the ice to the tree. Long arms reached out and pulled the princess from the tree, carefully bringing her back to the group. Long arms then lifted the prince and the princess together, placing them back through the window into the high room. They sat down, pretending nothing had happened. Moments later, the door swung open, and the queen entered. Her face froze when she saw the princess sitting there, safe and sound. She couldn't speak, but her lips curled into a forced, cold smile. "We're having a very interesting conversation," the prince said calmly. "We've been talking about trees and rivers." The queen, regaining her composure, said, "Come with me. It's late, and your bedroom is ready. Your servants can sleep there too." The prince said good night to the princess, and he and his servants followed the queen to a large room. The queen shut the door behind them and rushed to the cook. "Make a great fire under their room," she ordered, her eyes glinting with malice. Soon, the room began to grow unbearably hot. The prince went to the door and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. "I can hear a great fire below us," said Big Ear, pressing his ear to the floor. "This is wonderful," exclaimed Cold Man with a grin. He opened his coat, and in an instant, the room cooled down as snow and frost covered everything. The fire below was extinguished, leaving the room cold and safe. "I feel warm for the first time in my life," said Cold Man, smiling. "Open your coat, Cold Man," the prince said. Cold Man opened his coat, and instantly, the room became freezing again. "That's much better," they all said, shivering but relieved. Outside the room, the queen was listening at the door. She frowned when she heard their voices and rushed back to the cook. "Make the fire even hotter," she demanded. Inside, Cold Man chuckled. "I feel warm again," he said. "They're trying to cook us," cried one of the servants. "Take off your coat completely," the prince commanded. Reluctantly, Cold Man removed his coat. The moment he did, snow fell in the room, and it became unbearably cold. "I'm freezing," cried Cold Man. "Please, give me back my coat." But the prince refused. The room turned into a frozen wonderland. Snow covered the floor, and icicles formed on the walls. The prince and his servants were shivering uncontrollably. Fat Man's hair was covered in ice, and the prince's face turned blue with cold. None of them could speak. Outside, the queen listened at the door. Hearing no sound, she smirked. "They're dead now," she muttered to herself and opened the door. As soon as the door opened, the prince and his servants ran out, their teeth chattering. "Let's find a fire to sit by," said the prince, rubbing his frozen hands. "I can't feel my face or fingers." The queen stood frozen in shock, realizing her plan had failed. She knew now that she could never win. Defeated, she left the country, never to return. The princess married the prince, and they lived happily ever after. The loyal servants stayed with them, and together, they enjoyed a life filled with joy and peace.